All right, so we're going to keep on keeping on with Kant and deontology and how is it that we then determine our duty. Okay, so we have these four formulations. We're going to focus on two. The second one I already mentioned and talked about. The first one I also mentioned at the end of last time, and I'm going to pick up there with the more detailed explanation. You should only act in such a way that you could reasonably will your action would become a universal law, that everyone else would do what you were doing, and it be a better world. We're still keeping in the back of our minds this notion of best world, utopia. Talked about last time with reference to Rawls. Best world, and we all, Kant thinks, we all have the same understanding of what a best world would be like. Not a best world for me, but an objective best world for everyone. It's one of the things that reason can give us. Okay? So here's the more detailed explanation of the categorical imperative test. This is the scientific formula for determining that which is ethical, for determining our duties, for determining the moral, ethical law, ethical rule. All right, so the CI test. Step 1, determine the maxim of your actions. I will do X. Now notice, it is not I will do X in order to accomplish Y. That focuses too much on the consequences, too much on the results. We're not worrying about results, we're trying to get to intention. I will do X. It's not I will lie to Grandma to save her feelings. You know what you're really doing. You're lying to Grandma. So I will lie. Step 2, imagine that everyone lies. Not that everyone can lie, but that everyone does lie all of the time. Everyone must. They don't have permission. They must. Then imagine that world. Imagine a world where everyone lies. Then ask yourself, firstly, could I still lie? Could I still accomplish X? Could I still do the thing that I was considering doing in step 1? If you can't, then you should stop. That thing is unethical. And here's where Kant thinks lying comes in. You can't lie in a world where everyone else is lying all the time. Why not? Because lies only work within the context of truth-telling. Communication itself is predicated on truth claims, not false claims. It's why lies work. Have you ever seen the movie Invention of Lying? Not a good movie, but an interesting premise. Everyone tells the truth, all of the time, until one day someone invents the concept of lying. Guess what happens? He becomes really successful. He gets everything he wants. Because everyone presumes everything he's saying is true, because everything everyone else is saying is true. That's why lies work. If everyone's telling lies all of the time, there's no such thing as communication. So you actually can't tell a lie in a world where everyone else is lying. It fails the test of consistency, which Bernard Rayleigh talk about. Therefore, by the way, since it fails this test of consistency, we have a perfect duty to not perform those actions. We have a perfect duty to not lie. Now, Schrappe disagrees somewhat with Bernard Rayleigh on this point. I think that Kant is clear there is no distinction, there is no hierarchy between perfect duties and imperfect duties. A duty is a duty, do it, the end. Otherwise, you get into caveats. Otherwise, you get into particulars. Kant is attempting to avoid particulars. We're trying to make this universal for everyone all of the time, everywhere. That's the whole point of all of this. It's the whole point of the scientific formula for determining what the right thing to do is. Once you start throwing in order twos, it's too particular now. And again, you know what you're really trying to do. You can deceive others. Not ethically, but it's possible. You can't ultimately deceive yourself. You shouldn't, and you can't. Notice one of the issues then with something like deontology, and I'm not done with the formula yet, is it's really hard to determine someone else's intentions. Quite frankly, you don't have access to it at all, period. Which again is why when you see something unethical, you must start with why. What's the intentions behind this action? Because if the intentions are pure, okay, we can just work on the application then. But if the intention is messed up, it's a whole lot harder to fix. So if you can accomplish X in a world where everyone else is doing X too, then you have to ask yourself the second question. Is this a better world where everyone's doing X? If it's not a better world for everyone, then stop. It's unethical. You have an imperfect duty to not perform that action. We'll see a couple of examples of those in a minute. If it is a better world, this imagined world where everyone is doing this thing that you're considering doing, then you have a duty to do this thing. It's your ethical obligation. It should be an ethical rule. It should be an ethical law for everyone to do this thing because the world would be a better place. For example, this is one of the examples that Kant gives. You have an ethical obligation, duty. There's an ethical rule or law. You should cultivate your talents. Let's say in this system you want to plug in, I won't cultivate my talents. I'll be lazy. I won't bother working on myself and improving my own talents and so on and so forth. I won't work on those. I will not cultivate my talents. Everyone, therefore, must also not cultivate their talents. Imagine that world. Could you still not cultivate yours? Sure. It's not inconsistent. But is that a better world where no one cultivates their talents? Far worse world. And so if you can't will that everyone else be lazy, then you can't be lazy either. If you want to live in a world, no. Not want, it's about me again. If you realize reason, rationality, if you realize it is a better world, closer to utopia, better to the best, again, something somewhat Platonic and form-like here. If you realize through the reasoning process that it is a better world where people cultivate talents, guess what? You have to too. To be ethical. Now you still have a choice. You could choose not to, but you would also know that you're being unethical. You would know that you're attempting to be an exception to the moral rule. Kant's concerned about people who claim, well, I just didn't know what the right thing to do was. No longer have that excuse. You know exactly what the right thing to do is. You still have a choice whether to do it or not. But you don't have the excuse of, I didn't know. You know. You know. And again, even Kant says, most people may not conceive of it this way, but this is what most people are doing when they are acting ethically. Most people are thinking, what if everyone else did this too? Is that a better world or not? Boom. That's what this is. And what's interesting is considering the way that Kant is going about this and the particular way that it's based on reason. He can actually talk about you being ethical or unethical toward yourself. You could treat yourself as an object, as a mere means to someone else's ends. One-night stands, prostitution, things that Kant specifically talks about, by the way. He throws polygamy in there as well. There are ways that you could objectify yourself. Just because you've chosen to do so does not make it ethical. You're merely being unethical to yourself. Because think about it this way, if there's a stage play, right? You are an actor in the play. Some of the ethical theories we talk about will want you to remain in that actor role. I mean, what's this going to say about my character, for instance, if I perform this certain action in this play? Kant thinks that's too tied to self. You have to take a step beyond that. You really can't think like the actor. You have to think more like the director of the play. The director has a much more holistic picture of things, looking at how everything fits together. Not worried about you, but worried about the play. Kant is really not necessarily concerned about you. He's concerned about ideals. Ideals that should be upheld. Honesty all the time, everywhere. Cultivating talents all the time, everywhere, everyone. Notice, again, I'll reference that Big Bang Theory clip that I really hope that you were able to find. Sheldon references the people at the end of the line, but he really doesn't care about the people at the end of the line. He cares about line etiquette being maintained. Now, by consequence, that has ramifications for the people at the end of the line. Kant is idealistic. Uphold ideals. Ideals really take priority and precedence over individual people. It's why you can't lie to grandma. You can't place grandma above the ideal of honesty. Again, this isn't about lying sometimes or acting out of character occasionally or cultivating a different virtue. No. That's that gray stuff that leads far too many people astray. Uphold the ideal of honesty, period. All the time, everywhere, done. On one hand, it's pretty easy, really. You don't have to worry about what lies you told to what people. You don't have to worry about, gee, should I be honest this time? No, just all the time. Honesty is always the best policy. There is no such thing as brutal honesty or being too honest. Honest is honest. You have no control over how grandma is going to react to honesty. And quite frankly, it's not on you. That's not your responsibility. It's a better world where people are honest with one another. If she chooses to have her feelings hurt, that's a grandma problem, not a you problem. You merely intended to be honest. You didn't intend to hurt her feelings. Your intention is what you're praised or blamed for, and the intention that counts is because it is your duty to do so. And that's the only intention that counts. Kant has an interesting example about a suicidal fellow. And he says, and I'll quote Kant here. It is a duty to maintain one's life. That's a duty. And in addition, everyone also has a direct inclination to do so. That's different than duty. But on this account, the often anxious care which most men take for it has no intrinsic worth. And their maxim has no moral import. Because they're doing what they want. It's self-interest. It's emotion-based. That's not ethics. That's great that they happen to continue their existence, as well they should, but they don't realize why they should. The why is more important. Think about it this way. There's a distinction between rule following and rule obeying. Let's think about speed limits. Let's say I'm in an unfamiliar part of town, and I see no speed limit sign. But I make certain presumptions based upon the clues, right? Curbs, how wide the lanes are, whether there are marks on the lanes or not. Let's say I guess that it's 35. I'll guess. I don't know. I'll guess it's 35. And I proceed then to go 35 miles an hour. I then see a sign which confirms, yes, the speed limit is 35 miles an hour. Prior to seeing the sign, I just happened, by chance, to be following the law. I didn't know what the law was. I just happened by chance to be following it. Once I see the sign, now I have a choice to make. Now I can choose to obey the law and still go 35 or under, or choose to disobey the law and exceed 35 miles an hour. Notice I could not choose to disobey the law prior to knowing what the law was. Even had I been going 45 instead of 35 prior to seeing the sign, I would have just happened to not be following the law. Nothing to do with obeying or disobeying. Now tie that back into the suicide. If you're continuing your existence out of self-interest because life is awesome, you happen to be following the duty to maintain your existence. But you're not obeying the duty to maintain your existence. You can't obey that duty until you recognize that it's a duty. And you're probably not going to recognize it's a duty until you are faced with the alternative. Shroppy at least thinks about Hamlet, the most famous soliloquy, possibly in all of theater, probably at least in all of Shakespeare. To be or not to be? That is the question. He's talking about existence, man. Hamlet is asking himself, should I continue with existence, facing the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? Or should I just end it? Should I commit suicide because to die perchance to dream? Those are my options. They are both viable options for Hamlet at that point. I mean, if you haven't seen The Lion King, I'll summarize Hamlet for you. And yes, The Lion King is based primarily on Hamlet and Henry IV, Part 1. But anyway, right, in Hamlet, hopefully you've all read it. If you haven't read it, you've got to go read Hamlet. But I'll summarize. Hamlet's uncle has killed his father and married his mother. And now also wants to kill Hamlet too. Some stuff hasn't gone right for Hamlet, clearly. Right. His two best friends are not that bright, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They are so not bright, in fact, that they sometimes get confused as to which one is actually which. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, a fantastic play by Tom Stoppard, which is kind of a spin-off of these two friends from Hamlet. They both, by the way, end up getting themselves killed because they're carrying a message from the new king to another king, when the message was really supposed to be Hamlet was the messenger, but whatever. Plus, Hamlet's also got Ophelia over here, who's really kind of nagging him to get married. Like, look, I know you're depressed and all, Hamlet, but come on, can we get this marriage thing out of the way? Hamlet's got some stuff going on here. So then Hamlet tells Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, like, I'm done with all this stuff, right? Done the stuff. You guys should just end it. When you're in that place, when you no longer love life, now, instead of ending it, you should ask yourself this series of questions. Plug suicide into this formula to see if it's the ethical thing to do or not. So let's do that now, shall we? I will commit suicide. Everyone must commit suicide. Imagine that world. Not a better world. Even people contemplating suicide typically think about how much better the world will be without them, not without all people. That's robot thinking now. That's iRobot or something along those lines. The problem with humanity is the humans. Let's eliminate all of them. It still universalizes death, and that's still unethical. Suicide also universalizes death, unethical. Hitting people with trains universalizes death, unethical. Now, there are some Kantians who try to find a loophole in the trolley problem, by the way. So when I was presenting it, I was very specific in my wording. There are some Kantians who will try to claim that The ethical thing to do is to do nothing, because then you're not intending the death of 5 people. 5 people is just the death of 5 people is just the natural result of what was occurring. But by actively turning the train, or by actively pushing the fat man, you now are doing something. You now are truly intending something. And again, I'm leaving that question, what exactly is intent? Anyway, I'm leaving that out there for right now. And I've got an example I'm going to put on the discussion board to try to get to the heart of what do we mean when we say we intend something anyway? But suicide, unethical. And once you continue with life because it is your duty to do so, not because you want to, now you're being ethical. Because you're acting on behalf of your duty. You're doing something because it is your duty, and that's the only reason. No self-interest here. You don't want to continue living. You don't want to keep living, but you do it anyway because it's your duty to do so. Now you're ethical. Congratulations. I'll finish up this little section of Kant, the quote itself. They preserve their life as duty requires, no doubt, but not because duty requires. On the other hand, if adversity and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away the relish for life, if the unfortunate one, strong in mind, indignant at his fate, rather than desponding or dejected, wishes for death and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination of fear, but from duty, then his maxim has moral worth. Then and only then does his action have moral worth. Continuing existence even though you don't want to continue with existence. Talking a little bit about the goodwill. And I should point out, remember, these are ideals that we're attempting to uphold. It is idealistic in that sense. It is also perhaps somewhat idealistic in the more common understanding of idealistic, which is to say, man, this doesn't seem very realistic. Like, who can do this? Again, he's calling you to higher moral standards here. This is the moral high ground. This, again, is treating people better than they might want to be treated. Better than they might want to be treated. This moral high ground, let's be clear, could leave you unemployed. This is not Schrappe saying that every employer is unethical. This is Schrappe pointing out the obvious. There are some employers who are. Pardon me. If you have an employer, for instance, who wants you to go change price tags, let's say they were $100, this particular item, and he wants you to change the price tag to say, we're $200, on sale 50% off, now $100. The Kantian would probably say no. Sorry, can't do it, boss. Unethical. Seedy. Dishonest. No, I'm out. Whistleblowers, who, despite what the societal law says, do sometimes still get fired for whistleblowing. So some folks would say, so don't whistleblow. Right? Just go along to go along. Remember, going along means you're complicit. This requires you to call it out, even if you may lose your job. Part of lying, and Kant is clear on this, is also the making of promises that you have no intention of keeping. That's also a lie for Kant. So ethically, these two situations are very different. Ethically. Person one goes to the bank, gets a loan for a house that they know they cannot afford. The bank may also know they cannot afford it. The bank, therefore, also being unethical. But the individual is too. They know they cannot afford it. They have no intention of paying this loan back. No intention. Very, very different from person two, who gets a loan from the bank to purchase a house that they can afford, and they then lose their job. So now they can't afford it. The bank's taken back the house in both cases. Foreclosure is going to happen. Person one was unethical from the start, making a promise they knew they couldn't keep. Person two made a promise that they thought they could keep, and circumstances beyond their control prevented it. Person two is ethical. Intentions will shine like a jewel, Kant says, regardless of external stuff. Even if the results don't turn out well, this is the point behind Good Samaritan laws. You can't sue me if I break your rib giving you chest compressions to get your heart starting again. Why not? Because my intention was not to break your rib. My intention was to get your heart going again. I'm ethically off the hook here. Legally off the hook too. Ethically off the hook. My intent was to get your heart going. Very interesting example of the Good Samaritan law in the very first Incredibles movie. The guy who is trying to commit suicide sues Mr. Incredible for saving him. Mr. Incredible is shocked. He's like, I intended to save you. Like, well, how's this on me? My intention was to save you. Now, we can question Mr. Incredible's intentions throughout, especially the first movie. Is he really doing it for other people, or is he doing it for himself because he likes being Mr. Incredible? We can question his motivations and his intentions. We ultimately don't know what they are. Only he truly knows. Only he truly knows the intentions of his own heart. We don't. We can't determine that even based upon particular results, because remember, results are different than intentions. Results are beyond your control. He may become famous because he's doing these things to help people. That's different than doing these things for people in order to become famous. And Kant is very clear on that distinction. Not that particular example, but that distinction between the motivation. You're doing it because, for goodness sake, doing it because it's the right thing to do, doing it because it is your duty, doing it because you would will that others do it too, doing it because everyone is an end unto themselves and you don't want to use them merely as a means, or are you doing it for fame? First one ethical, second one unethical, even though the actions may be completely the same. Completely the same. Shrapi can't swim. She never learned how. I didn't learn how to ride a bike until I was an adult, which, by the way, no adult training wheels that I found. But I eventually learned how to ride a bike great. Still don't know how to swim, though. If I'm walking past that pond or that pool from the very first day worth of examples I gave you, where we got the dog and the stranger, I should not dive in to try to save them, because then we all three die. But if I intend to help and intend to save them, I will do something. I just won't be diving in. And notice for Kant, it's very, very clear which one you should try to save first. It's not your dog. People are intrinsically more valuable than dogs. Again, this does not mean you should mistreat dogs. This does mean that people have a greater intrinsic value than dogs. Save the person, even though they're a stranger. Even though they may be a horrible, horrendous person. You're not on the hook for that. You intended to save a person. You're not even ethically on the hook if they both end up dying, as long as you tried to do something. Right? The thought that counts we hear all the time. That's intentions-based stuff, man. That's intentions-based stuff. This higher moral standard. Pretty idealistic. Not impossible. Pretty idealistic. Ideals. 4 examples, okay. Checking my list here to see what else I wanted to cover. in this particular video. So tying it back to the text here, we've got this emphasis on reason. The good will is motivated solely by moral duty. We just talked about that. Hypothetical versus categorical imperative distinction. Talked about that last time. The principle of ends. We talked about that. It's interesting he brings up teachers here. There are some teachers who teach purely for the money. That's their motivation. That's their intention. Other teachers teach, cultivating talents or something along those lines. They care about students, blah, blah, blah. Any other number of reasons. And they just happen to get paid. I would presume even at this point, you can tell the difference between which ones are which. You know whose motivations are themselves and whose motivations are others. And hopefully it's clear what my intentions are. The golden rule, right? This universalizability, this consistency that's more strict than the golden rule, pages 160 to 161. Perfect duties and imperfect duties that, again, I think the Burnham really are not quite right about. People discover the moral law for themselves through reason itself. Talked about that already as well. You can't control the outcomes. Yep. Okay. Let's see what else from Kant himself, if there's anything else. Again, Nietzsche at least thinks that this is indicative of the Judeo-Christian ethic. If you look at something like the Ten Commandments or something along those lines, there's no caveats. There's periods. There's maxims of actions. I will not bear false witness. Period. I will not covet thy neighbor's wife, regardless of how hot she is. I will not. Anywhere, under any circumstance. These rules, laws, duties of the moral type hold. There's periods, not commas. A good will is not good because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. It is good in itself. The good will. Reason, volition. And again, not want. Volition and will is different than want. This is objective, not subjective. Wants are subjective. Better world is objective. Even if this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, there should remain only the good will, then like a jewel it would still shine by its own light. Shrapi wouldn't be on the hook for the death of the dog and the stranger, as long as Shrapi actually tried to do something. This duty requires, let's see, I'm just so you know, I'm not making this stuff up again, quoting Kant here. This is from the Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals. Although no doubt common men do not conceive it, ethics, in such an abstract and universal form, they always have it really before their eyes and use it as the standard in their decisions. All right, that's good for this video. I'm trying to keep them a little bit shorter. So for this video, I'll come back then with some more strengths, some more weaknesses, some more points of clarification for deontology and Kant's ethics.